So welcome everyone. My name is Natalie Topa. I work with WFP as the Global Advisor for Regenerative Resilience. And I work with our team in ecosystem restoration, community infrastructure, and livelihoods, also sometimes referred to as ACL previously, the whole FFA team. And our team works in restorative action around the world. Maybe many people are familiar with our work from the Sahel, but this approach of thinking about how to restore and regenerate ecosystem function around our planet is really something that underpins community resilience. And this is something that has been true of human civilization for thousands of years. I first met Andrew. Andrew was familiar with my work far before I joined WFP. And I'm as a permaculture trainer, conducting permaculture trainings around the world. And I think it was 7 or 8 years ago that Andrew reached out to me to be on his podcast called Earth Repair Radio. And we've just been, together in the global regenerative and permaculture movement around the world since then. And then a couple of years ago, when I joined WFP 2.5 years ago, Andrew reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm going to be in Senegal. Do you have anything? I'm going to be there filming. Is there anything that you would suggest I film in Senegal?" And at that time, I was new to WFP, and our team members in RBD in Senegal had never heard of me or Andrew, and I just begged them, please let Andrew go with you into the field and do some filming. That was a 2-day mission. And of course, our WFP colleagues were super open and supportive. Andrew spent 2 days with them in the field. And just from that small footage that he was able to get, seeing a lot of projects in Senegal, stitched together a video which ended up going quite viral with over 16 million views now. So based on that, I had organized with Atovoli and other colleagues for us to go on a mission specifically to document the work that we've been doing. And that resulted in a 3-week mission in Niger and Chad, where RBD teams and country teams went with Andrew all over to document different projects and the results and impacts on the ground. I think right now we are getting close to 30 million video views with those initial 3 videos. A new video was recently released just a few days ago, and we're also working on another one for Tandu Valley. So it's been a really amazing journey and a good reminder that, it's not always enough to just do good work. You also have to know how to tell the good story. And that is something that Andrew really excels in. So Andrew Millison is a YouTuber, permaculture influencer, a lecturer at the Oregon State University, and I'm pretty sure, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is really one of the first, if not the first, official university level program within the United States that has such a comprehensive focus on permaculture and the whole permaculture package of thinking, which goes far beyond agriculture, by the way. So based on some of the success of the videos that we had, WFP, thanks again to Atovoli and our colleagues in RBD, let me back up. Last year in November, Andrew brought me to Taiwan to speak at the International Permaculture Convergence, where we did a little bit of, leisure and tourism together with his family, and then also attended the International Permaculture Convergence. And then after that, WFP covered the costs of Andrew to come to COP in Saudi Arabia to give a presentation about, how agencies can really be telling the story of the good work that we're doing in a new way that's, that doesn't just speak to people within our industry. So Andrew has sort of inadvertently become a friend of WFP, and we continue to coordinate on more videos and more exciting ways to tell the story of the work we're doing at WFP. But today I asked Andrew to give a presentation, not about video making and YouTube, but to really unpack a bit of what he's seen and examples around the world of how permaculture and regenerative applications are really applied at scale. Now for WFP, with our FFA programming around the world, we do already know the impact of land restoration, how this can directly contribute to livelihoods, food security, disaster risk reduction, nutrition security. But I think that, we have still a lot of space to grow within this type of programming. And Andrew's going to spend the next, 50 minutes or so giving a presentation with examples and insights around the world about how the permaculture lens has been applied to areas to really restore the resilience of communities in different contexts, and not only dry lands, right? This is not something that is only applicable in desertifying contexts. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, if you want to more to introduce yourself. Otherwise, we can go ahead and just launch into the presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session after the presentation. So feel free to stand by for that. So Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. And it's really an honor to get to speak to all of you in all your different locations around the world. And I've really had a great experience working with the World Food Program so far. And I feel like some of the resilience work happening from the World Food Program is just some of the most innovative work happening on the planet. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Like Natalie said, I have had the opportunity to do a lot of traveling around the planet through my work with Oregon State University and doing this documentation work, and seen a lot of the more innovative and large-scale work. And so I'm going to share some of that with you. I wanted to say this opening slide here, it says permaculture and the watershed approach to design. What you're looking at right here is a model that is used for training villagers. This model is used by the Paani Foundation in India, which is, I would consider, one of the largest land transformation projects and land rehabilitation projects on Earth. But I just love that they create these scale models, and then they'll actually pour water over this model to demonstrate what a restored watershed and agricultural system looks like. So maybe the World Food Program wants to spend some time making some models. I guess you actually make models in the sand. I've seen that. So that's a great tactic as well. So like Natalie said, I am an instructor at Oregon State University, and I founded a program there. We mostly do online education. I also teach on campus, and I've been at Oregon State University since 2009. So 16 years now at the university. And because I created this online program, that was my gateway into media production. And so that's how I was led to work with the World Food Program, and got to spend some great time with you all in Africa. So I'm going to start by just a simple definition. I actually really don't like slides that are text only, but I have one to start with here. So I'm going to read you. This is my definition of permaculture for some of you who may not be familiar. So permaculture design is a method of landscape planning that can be applied at scales from the home garden to city block to village to farm. It's an ethically based whole systems design approach that uses concepts, principles, and methods derived from ecosystems, indigenous peoples, and other time-tested practices to create sustainable human settlements and institutions. Although rooted in horticulture and agriculture, permaculture design is interdisciplinary, touching on a wide range of subjects, including regional planning, ecology, animal husbandry, appropriate technology, architecture, economy, and international development. So in a sense, permaculture is a lot of things, right? And we can talk about many different aspects, and we'll touch on some of those in this talk. But to start out, I want to give you a little bit of background, just basic background information about permaculture, so you understand where I'm coming from when we visit a lot of the sites that we're seeing. So in permaculture, we talk about different types of investments of energy, right? And the first type of investment is degenerative. And a degenerative investment is where we put some sort of resources, energy, finances, our own time into an investment that degrades over time. So the archetypal degenerative investment is like a car, right? When you purchase a car, I've never purchased a car new off of the lot, maybe some of you have, but when you purchase a car new off of the lot and you drive it off of the lot, you basically loses value immediately. If you drive around the block and you bring it back to the car lot, they will pay you less money than you paid them to take it away from the lot. A car breaks down, it pollutes while it gets you around. You need to replace parts, you need to change the tires, and eventually the car, at the end of its life, will be hauled off to the junkyard and will no longer be useful at all, right? Now, the next type of investment we look at is a generative investment. So a generative investment is an investment that generates a yield that is equal to the investment. So we think of an annual crop, a maize crop in the example I have there, where basically you prepare the field, you will plant the maize seeds, you add water, you weed, you manage that crop, and eventually you harvest the maize. But if you don't replant again, then you're not going to have another maize crop. So you have to then put that same investment in the next year or the next growing season. Then the third type of investment is what we think of as a regenerative investment. A regenerative investment creates more energy than the initial investment and actually improves over time, right? And so this is where we look at perennial plants. And in this example, I have a fruit tree, where if you plant a fruit tree and you put it in the right place and you get it established, and that fruit tree may bear fruit for more years. In fact, you may be gone from this earth, and that fruit tree could still have increasing productivity year after year. So in permaculture, we're looking at how do we maximize our regenerative investments? How do we put our energy into systems that are actually going to create more energy and are going to improve over time, right? So that's where we put our focus in the permaculture design system. And there are a lot of tools that we use in permaculture in the process of designing a site, right? So as I showed you in the definition, permaculture is actually a design system. It's a design protocol. And one of the tools that we use in analysis, in the initial analysis of a site, is we use what we call the sector compass, right? Or the sector analysis, where we look at the sectors in permaculture we define as outside forces that are coming into a site. So we're mapping things like, where's a potential wildfire going to come in from? What direction? Based on wind direction, based on slope, based on the type of fuel that we have present, right? What direction's the prevailing wind? What direction is the summer sun or the winter sun coming from? What direction do wildlife come from? Potentially, what direction do we have crime or security situation from? So we're mapping these forces, and then our design ends up being a response to these forces. So where I live in the Northern Hemisphere at 45 degrees latitude, we're like, oh, the winter sun is a very important force that's coming in from outside the site. So how would we maximize that? How would I actually break the wind, create a windbreak where I might have drying or damaging winds in the desert, right? So this is a key permaculture tool that we use. And when we're designing in permaculture, when we're analyzing a site, and then we're actually trying to create a design that's maximizing these regenerative investments, we're looking at these two forces, right? One force is entropy, right? The second law of thermodynamics, where we have a gradual decline into disorder, right? And then the other force that we're really trying to utilize in permaculture is syntropy, where we have a tendency towards order, complexity, and organization, right? So how can we create a system that actually builds complexity instead of disperses energy? So here I have a picture of a site that I filmed in Hawaii. And this is a restoration site where a group of indigenous Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, are actually restoring their traditional agricultural system. And this is a large group of people passing stones up and rebuilding terraces that will collect energy and actually harvest water and build nutrients to increase fertility over time, right? So this is the type of momentum that we're looking at in a permaculture system. And in permaculture, we're looking at natural systems. We're looking at natural patterns. We're observing them, and we're saying, how can we learn from nature, learn from natural patterns, and actually build our human designs for agriculture, for economy, for human settlements, and how can we actually mimic those designs after natural patterns? So someone's got their mic on. Just check your mic right there. Hear some background noise. And so this right here is the vascular system of a leaf.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andrew. Can everyone please turn off your microphones so that Andrew can speak without the background noise?
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie. So a leaf, right? The vascular system of a leaf is it's there to transport nutrients and water throughout the plant system, right? And when we look at patterns like that, we see the same patterns repeating in different places in nature. So you can look at that, you can be like, wow, that actually also looks a bit like the way that in a watershed, we have streams coming together and how the land actually distributes water throughout the landscape, right? That also looks like the way that our veins distribute water and nutrients throughout our own body. So we have this repetition of patterns in nature, and in the permaculture design system, we're looking at how do we actually create systems that use the greatest wisdom of nature and mimic a lot of those systems. And so when we look at the landscape, right, we have these two opposing forces in most landscapes. One force is, like, you can see the water flow patterns that are happening here. So one force is the way that water flows across the landscape, the way that soils are distributed, and the natural land is shaped. And then this other force that we have are the lines that I highlighted in red. And these represent the human management units, property boundaries, places where we have fences, roads, and we have a division of property, right? So we have this pattern that humans have superimposed on the landscape. And then we have this underlying pattern of water flow. And these two things, in many cases, are actually contradictory to each other. So in many cases, we have human land management based on property boundaries, but this is really an artificial division of landscape. And in many ways, in many circumstances, this actually is damaging, right? And actually counterproductive to the natural systems that underlie it. Okay, so I'll show you some extreme examples. The extreme example is when we look at the urban grid and the grid of roads and houses that are placed over the landscape. So San Francisco is an extreme example. If anybody's ever visited there, it's the city of hills, right? And what happens when we place the human grid over the natural landscape is the roadways become the new channels for water to move. And so we put in roadways, and in the urban situation, we put in storm drains and gutters, and then the water now moves through the landscape down roadways instead of through the natural pattern of drainage that we find in nature. Now, this is an extreme example, but even in rural landscapes, the roadways still become the new conduits for water. And this human superimposed transport system and property boundaries now becomes can become very damaging to the natural hydrology of the landscape, how water would naturally like to flow. And so in permaculture and in regenerative design, sustainable design, we're always needing to look at the natural patterns that underlie the human created boundaries, right? So this is a site that I worked on, and this is very typical of what we're faced when we are designing sites, because the property boundary that is highlighted in black here, this boundary of the site, you can see that the natural landform extends out beyond this boundary. And the water that's flowing onto the site, actually, the watershed is starting on higher ground that is off this site, right? So when we're doing design, we're looking beyond the human property boundary, and we're looking at the natural topography, the geomorphology, the land shape, and the watershed, the water flow. And so these are really informing our design. And when we're designing in permaculture, we're looking at, and this is some of Natalie's terminology, and I love to borrow Natalie's terminology because she's a real regenerative design wordsmith, right? So we look at the Holy Trinity. We look at geology, hydrology, and biology. Geology is representing the soils, right? We've got the natural soil formation, and we're always working with what the soil conditions are, right? And then we have the hydrology, which is the way that the water flows over the landscape, the way that the water is soaking down into the ground, and how water tables are interacting with the underground geology. And then we have the biology, or the biodiversity. And this represents the plant life, the animal life, actually the soil microbiology. So when we're looking at this permaculture and regenerative design, we are designing for these three aspects. Okay. And we're looking at the land from the watershed perspective. Okay. So this is the nation of India. This is an incomplete picture of the watershed because the watersheds of India actually extend into neighboring countries, Bangladesh, of course, and Pakistan. But here, this is a map of India. This is a hydrologic map of India. So this is a map of India where we see the watershed basins, the river basins here. And if you know how the political map of India, you'll know that the political map of India does not correspond to the watershed map. The political map of India is actually by language types. That's how the states are divided in India, not by watershed. Okay. And the area of India that we're going to look at in this first part of the project here is there in the center of the country. I put a star, and that is an arid steppe area. If you're familiar with the Köppen-Geiger climate classification system, we're looking at the BSH. And this is an area of India that gets monsoon rains, but has a long, extended dry season. So it might rain 3 to 4 months out of the year, and then it will be dry for 8 or 9 months out of the year. So it's a little more interior steppe. And I'm going to talk to you about the work of the Paani Foundation. This is in the state of Maharashtra, India. The Paani Foundation was actually founded by a very famous Bollywood star, leading man, Amir Khan, who's been in many, many very popular movies throughout India. And the fact that the organization was founded by a famous Bollywood star has really helped, because he's able to gather a lot of resources and also the adoration of the population, because he's a very well-known figure. And what this is they actually hold a contest between villages where they train the villages, they train a few representatives of each village in watershed restoration, in how to create structures and systems within the village that soak water into the ground. because these villages were in a desperate situation, right? These villages were drying out, their water tables were depleting, and villagers could only plant crops during the wet season. And then during the dry season, during the long dry season, as many places in the world, oftentimes the villagers had to migrate away. So in the case of Maharashtra, oftentimes they had to migrate to the city, the mega city of Mumbai, live in the slums, and work low-wage jobs during the dry season in order to have enough money to survive, and then returning to the villages during the wet season to grow crops. And so Amir Khan, the Bollywood star, he recognized this problem, and they came up with this very innovative solution to create a contest between villages to see which village could install the most amount of water harvesting structures in a 45-day period. So they made a very big deal out of it, and the villagers came out in force, and they would compete with each other in the contest. And they would build those water harvesting structures during the dry season in this 45 days, and then the monsoon rains would come and fill this vast amount of water harvesting structures that were built. And then within one wet season, that water would then infiltrate into the ground and rebuild the water table of these entire villages. So they literally would fix their water problems in one season, in one 45-day period, and then one rainy season, recharge the water table, and then immediately they had enough water to grow a second crop. And this had a huge impact. They've had about 8,000 villages compete in this water cup competition. Each village has an average population of about 2,000 people. And so we're talking about 16 million people that were benefited by this project. And 1,000 of these villages, they say, actually completely and permanently fixed their water problems, right? So this is an incredible story. I have about 6 videos about this organization on my YouTube channel. I've visited a number of villages with them and seen this with my own eyes. And the thing about these villages that is such an advantage compared to, say, where I live here in the United States is that the village boundaries correspond to the watershed boundaries, to the hydrologic boundaries. So the village boundaries are aligned with the drainage basin, with the way that water flows in the landscape here. So you can see here, I just showed on a map, this is one of the villages I visited called Pemgiri, and you can see the hills and the basin around there, and then you can see the topographic map on the right that shows the basin that encompasses this village. So it's a real advantage because the political boundaries actually correspond to the hydrologic boundaries, right? And this is the center of one of these villages. This is a village of Pimpri Jalsan that I visited. You can see me photographing. In the center of the village, they have the map of the village lands, and this is a map showing the watershed improvements that they made to the village. And so every single person in this village comes to the center of the village, and they all now understand how the village water system was saved. From the smallest child comes and can read this and can understand the geography to the most elder person here. They all now are educated about watershed restoration. They all understand how their village changed fortunes from being impoverished and dry to being rehydrated and really wealthy, right? And this is that same village that I just showed you the map there. And this is what it looks like now in the village. And this is the dry season. So I was visiting this is probably December. So December is one of it's kind of right in the middle of the dry season. You know, the monsoons are around June, July, August, right? So this is months into the dry season. And you can see, well, you can see the hills in the background They've restored those hills, done a lot of water harvesting structures on those hills. And then you can see the waterway coming through the center of the image where they have a little check dam where they have water built up. And then in the foreground of the image, you can see an open well, a circular open well. So you can see that the water table, you can even see inside that well, you can see that the water table is just below the surface. And then all around, we see crops, right? We see healthy crops growing, and these crops represent economy, right? So where, like I said, before we started, where they were only planting during the rains, one crop per year, and if the rains failed, then the economy failed. Basically, people became impoverished instantly if they had a failure of the monsoons, a poor rain, or off-timing rains that damaged the crops. But now, once they restored their water table and they could water during the dry season, then people literally were doubling their income, and they stored enough groundwater that typically they could make it through 2 or 3 failed monsoon seasons before they depleted their water table. So they suddenly had hydrologic and economic security, well, and of course, food security as well. So I can't stress how dramatic the impacts are when you actually go to these villages and talk to the people. They literally turn their entire fortunes of the villages around in a 45-day period. It's really spectacular. And there's some principles that are really important to look at of how they're using. This is not India. This is actually a picture of a permaculture design site that is near me in the state of Oregon, in the United States. But the principle of gravity, of holding water up high in the landscape and being able to use that water through gravity to irrigate areas below, right? It's a very simple principle that we're all very familiar with. But when we apply the concept of gravity to creating integrated watershed designs, we find great advantages to storing water up high. So that's a core principle that we use. And then the principle of hydrologic stabilization. This is another village here in India, a completely different project that I visited. And this is in Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a much more arid area. Okay, it's very hot. It's a desert area where, again, they get intense monsoon rains for a short period of time during the year. This is the village of Laporia here. And again, this is a village that was on a downward spiral. And back actually in the 1980s, so over 45 years ago, they started a watershed scale restoration project in this village. And they have achieved a level now of groundwater stability that you can see. Again, this is the dry season in the desert of Rajasthan, and we see a lake here right in front of the village, and we see green fields surrounding. So when you do this watershed type work and you achieve groundwater, hydrologic stabilization and a permanent building of the groundwater table where they can get through multiple years of drought with the stored water, we have not only water stability, not only economic stability, and not only food security, but we also have wildlife stability. Wildlife coming back because trees are integrated, trees are growing, there's open water bodies. The whole matrix of the ecology and the economy are all lifted up together when we apply these design principles. Okay, so we're going to jump over to Africa, and I guess it's kind of ironic that I'm going to be presenting to the WFP about WFP projects, because many of you that are listening know much more in depth about these projects than I do, but some of you may be in the WFP and not even know some of the incredible work that's happening inside your own organization. So to the climate map here, I put stars on the 2 areas that I'm going to be showing you. And these are the 2 areas that I've visited with the World Food Program. One is Senegal, right? I visited the border between Senegal and Mauritania there, right where the Senegal River crosses through. And then I'm going to go to the southern part of Niger. Both of these are the Sahel. Now, the Sahel, you'll see the same color there on the map is the same color that we looked at when we were looking at India. So this is the BSH arid steppe. But unlike India, in India, that climate type was adjacent to wetter climate types, where here the arid steppe is adjacent to the red color, which is the hot arid desert, the Sahara Desert, right? So it's a little more influenced from the hot desert than from the wetter climates. And I visited the projects that could be included in the Great Green Wall, right? The Great Green Wall is a band of trees being planted across the entire Sahel to keep back the expansion of the Sahara Desert. Right? And so what we looked at, and this is in Senegal, and this is a very early project. This is just 2 years in, and it's modular design. By modular design, I mean that we have these half moons. Each one of these half moons that was constructed is its own water harvesting unit, right? And then when you have all of these individual half moons that are dug, harvesting the water that's flowing down there, and you have them all placed in this pattern across the landscape, we go from these single units of the half moons to this vast array of, they almost look like scales, like the scales of a snake or something like that. We have this pattern that's been put across the landscape that is then collecting the water that's flowing and the nutrients that are flowing during heavy rains, and they're concentrating inside each one of these half moons. Okay. And the results of this, okay, the results of this are that we have a landscape that can go from a bare, desertified, compacted, soiled landscape to an abundant landscape that can support many different species of livestock, can support people. There's a lot of different types of half moons. And in this picture here, we see a landscape. You can still see these patches of grass that represent where the half moons were that have now turned into a savanna grassland, right? So this is a low-tech process-based solution. Process-based meaning that these structures are working off of the process that when it rains, when the rain falls across the landscape, it picks up nutrients, organic material, and it flows. And if we can intercept that flow, then we create these collection basins, these catcher's mitts for nutrients and water that become concentrations of hydrated, fertile soil that then can grow grasses, can grow annual crops, can grow trees, can grow the stuff that makes the basis for food security. And so, before these structures start to collect water and start to collect soil and nutrients, they're just basically holes. They're just holes that are excavated and the soil piled on one side there. And there's a lot of different styles. So in my tour of Chad and Niger and Senegal, I saw many different styles, and the styles of half moons will be based on what the soil type is, what the rainfall amount is, and then what the specific goal for that area is, right? So these half moons you can see are different. These half moons actually incorporate these deep trenches, and on the inside of the half moon, and then on the outside of the half moon, you can see these little tufts of vegetation. Those are what we call pits. That's vegetation that has grown into these pits that are dug outside the half moon. And then this particular style is really conducive to silvopasture. And silvopasture is when we're growing trees and we're growing plants where we have a system that is working with grazing animals, right? So this diagram that I drew for the video that we made from Niger shows how when it rains, the water flows, it's collected into the half moon, and inside the half moon, you could have grasses growing, shrubs, and then oftentimes a tree is planted. And that tree is usually a pioneer, thorny, very hardy species that can then grow up and start to and then this system starts to, it not only accumulates energy that's flowing into it, but it starts to generate its own fertility, because the tree grows up and then the leaves of the tree fall down, they create mulch. Birds come, they fly, they land in the tree, they add their bird droppings to the system. And so, like I was talking about, a regenerative system that works on syntropy, this half moon structure, it accumulates energy. Every time it rains, it accumulates more water, more nutrients. Every time leaves drop, every time a bird lands, every time another species comes in, it accumulates more energy, right? So that's the type of process-based design that we are trying to implement with permaculture and with this resilience design. Here's another picture just showing the half moons full of water, showing some of the vegetation growing in. Actually, I traveled here with Voli, who's on this call, and I want to point out that Voli was actually not very happy with this site, because he felt like this site that had been taken into a tree-based system was actually, you can see the amount of bare ground here, that this site was actually starting to degrade back into desert. And Voli said, if they had 2 years of drought and the overgrazing happening on the site continued, that this site could actually go all the way back to desert. So it's not like you can just put these systems in and leave them. The management is critical over time. And so that was one of the most fascinating things for me about visiting these sites in Niger and visiting these sites in Chad, especially visiting them with Voli, going around with Natalie and all the other people that were working in the NGOs in Chad and Niger, and all the other people working for the World Food Program, was to see that, see how some sites, the management had been done well, and the syntropy was increasing, the forest cover and vegetative cover was only increasing, yet some sites where the grazing, the balance between grazing and not grazing had been tipped over, where the sites were actually starting to move back to desertification. So it's not that simple of an equation. The long-term management is a very critical part of the equation in these sites here. So just a few other little details. You can see that the orientation of these half moons is based on slope, right? So the open side of the moon is facing upslope, where the water can accumulate into these sites. And what we see with these systems is we see landscape scale water infiltration. So this is a picture that was taken from a drone not long after some heavy rains fell on this particular site. And we can see water just pooling throughout the site. Now you have to imagine what was happening prior to the installation of these structures. Prior to these half moons being put in, on many of the sites I visited, they said that there was bare, compacted soil. In some cases, the one I went to in Senegal, they said that nobody had cultivated that land for 40 years. It had been 40 years that that land had been considered a wasteland, right? So in a wasteland, the water falls and it just rushes off. It leaves the system. It flows down slope. But here in this system, the water is sticking around. It's collected by the half moons on a large landscape-wide scale, and then that water is soaking into the ground and actually replenishing the aquifer. So it's growing the vegetation, it's moistening the soils, it's bringing back wildlife, it's bringing back a food system, shade, temperature moderation, wind protection, all of these vast benefits, and also recharging the water table. And what we see perennial vegetation establishment. I mean, so look, you would never guess that this had been a degraded landscape 10 years earlier, right? And this is a site in Niger, I believe. And this is, now you see a biodiverse forest returning. And the forest isn't just for wildlife, but there are a lot of these trees are being eaten by camels, by goats. They're being harvested for firewood. There's fruits, nuts, seeds that can be harvested here. There's grasses growing in underneath, and a lot of different species are finding their way in. It's not that all these species need to be planted. They plant the hardy pioneer species, and then birds and other animals actually bring in the seeds of other species. And so you start to set off this regenerative flywheel, right? This whole momentum where once you get the system established, then nature starts to introduce its own other species into here. And in one of the sites that we visited in Niger, monkeys had actually reintroduced themselves into the jungle system. So from barren, compacted, bare landscape to a biodiverse jungle where monkeys are moving in, I mean, it's very dramatic change. And here's me just kind of kneeling under. So this is the one that I'm talking about where monkeys had introduced. And this is what it looks like down there under the trees. You can see the shade. There's little patches of sunlight here and there, but you're talking about a fairly contiguous tree canopy with different species underneath, grasses, and a spongy, moist soil. So we have nutrient cycling because these trees, they are nitrogen fixing. They're creating great soil conditions underneath the ground through the nitrogen nodules on their roots. They're dropping organic material from their leaves. They're building up the soil. These grasses are growing. Animals are coming, grazing. The animals are then, producing manure. And then that manure is a way for more nutrients to cycle, and it introduces more microorganisms into the soil. So you just get this cycle started where the soil actually just begins to improve on its own. And then, of course, we get soil moistening. Now, this is a picture, of course, showing a lot of water harvesting half moons after a rainstorm. This is a site that we visited in Chad, in the Mongo region of Chad here. But you can see when the ground is covered, it's going to retain moisture in the soil. The ground cover, it serves as like a blanket over the soil, right? And when you think of a blanket over the soil, when the rain comes, then that soil is not going to dry out. When the sun comes out, that blanket's going to protect and keep the soil moist. So that's another principle that we're trying to work with when we're doing this type of work, these type of projects. Okay, and then of course, cooling. If we're shading the soil, if we're covering the soil, we're also cooling the soil. When we cool the soil, we have a much better growing environment for these plants and for animals and for microorganisms. Because when the sun hits in the dry season and the hot sun and it bakes that soil, it can bake the life out of that soil. So when we keep the soil cooled, then we are maintaining more life in the soil. Now, one interesting thing when I was in Niger, so this is in Niger, one of the sites that we visited. Again, this is about like somewhere between 8 and 10-year-old project, right? And you can see, if you look carefully, you can still see the remnant shapes of the half moons kind of in the foreground there. But one of the interesting things that the forest ranger told me that was touring me around the site was that so the trees cool the ambient air temperature of the area where we have the restoration, but also it cools the ambient air temperature of the adjacent areas. So the cooling effect of the air actually migrates and moves, and the whole region around this site is cooled as well. So what they say is that because of the cooling of the air temperature, because of the wind protection, because of the new hydrologic effects, that for every area that is treated, the effects actually expand 3 times. So if you treat 1,000 hectares with these water harvesting structures, you're actually going to have an effect of about 3,000 hectares because of the downwind, downstream, and ambient air temperature effects. And so the thing that's really like brings it back to the mission of the World Food Program is that the recovery of degraded landscapes equals the alleviation of hunger and poverty, right? So the World Food Program is spending a lot of effort, time, money, energy to feed people. But when you recover degraded landscapes, you are feeding people. And we saw this in Niger, where over the last 5 years, there had been an average of about 3 million people that were receiving emergency food assistance from the World Food Program. Over this time period that these resilience techniques have been implemented since about 2014, 500,000 people, 500,000 people have been removed permanently from long-term food assistance, right? So this is like 500,000 people that no longer are fed consistently by the WFP. So these structures, these systems, when you put them in place, they actually end up saving money over the long term, creating long-term resilience. Now, this is from Senegal here, and this is an experiment. Sebastian Muller, who was working there in Senegal, now I believe he's over in the Kenya area. This is a system that is from Brazil called centropic agriculture. So you see the half moons in the middle, and you can see the sorghum being grown in those half moons. But then on these other trenches on outside of the half moons, these are actually perennial, nutrient producing perennial crops. So they're actually growing soil, growing the organic matter that can be turned into soil. So it's like the perennial systems outside of these annual crops in the middle are like nutrient engines that keep producing more and more biomass for soil production year after year after year. So there's some really innovative experiments that are going on from the WFP, especially like this one in Senegal. And they are directly leading to the alleviation of hunger and poverty of the populations that are working on these projects and affected by them. So what's the scalability? Well, I mean, in Niger alone, we've got 300,000 hectares that has been treated with these half moons. So it's the country that is the farthest ahead as far as land area. And, you know, like I talked about the modular design, not all of the systems are within the watershed scale. Like we saw in India, they're treating an entire watershed. Well, here, because of the modular design of the water harvesting structures, you could sort of like make this pattern go on fragmented parts of the landscape that are not connected to the greater watershed, right? So this particular aspect of your work has proven to be extremely scalable within the Sahel zone. But I'm going to show you another example of scalability that I found very interesting. So I just spent a week touring sites, a whole nationwide restoration project in Timor-Leste, also known as East Timor. And here's where Timor-Leste is on the map. They only gained independence from Indonesia in the last 23 years, right? So they had a horrible war of independence against Indonesia, where actually a third of the population was killed or died of famine between 1975 and it really peaked in 1999. So I just spent a week touring in Timor-Leste, and this is a Geiger climate classification map. You can see that Timor-Leste, so this is a totally different climate zone now. This is the tropical savanna. So this is basically the wet, dry tropics, where they have roughly half a year where they have rain, and then roughly half a year where it is dry there. So this is me interviewing the president. This is the president of Timor-Leste. So I got to go there. Timor-Leste is a nation of only, I think there's 1.3 million people in the entire country. So it's a small country. And because because my connection there is with the person who has implemented permaculture there over the last about 25 years, before they even gained independence, I had access to the president. I interviewed the president, I interviewed the minister of agriculture, and I also interviewed the minister of education. So this land transformation happening there is happening at the highest levels of government that they are aware of and supportive of this project here. So one thing to understand about Timor-Leste, they have about 47% childhood malnutrition. Now, we don't have data yet about how that number has changed since they implemented the work that I'm going to show you in the rest of this presentation. Okay? But this is Timor-Leste. You can see it's half of the island of Timor. And then this is a little bit of a topographic model just to show you this is an extremely mountainous country, right? But again, when we're looking and analyzing the site, we're looking at topography, we're looking at geomorphology, and we're looking at the watershed. So here, and from the permaculture perspective, we're like, what's the watershed? How's it flow? What's the geology like? And then, especially for this country, you can see that if you look at the green color on this map, there is barely any flat land. This is extremely mountainous. We usually think of the most productive agricultural lands of a nation. We think that it's the low-lying, flat, valley bottom lands. But here in Timor, it's extremely mountainous. You can see we barely have any. I just want to say I am aware that I am at about 50 minutes. So I'm aware of my time. And I don't have too much more to go. We just have to look at Timor. So anyway, so Timor, extremely mountainous. And what that means is that where in other places we would think that the water supply, that you would be pumping water from low-lying coastal, low-lying aquifers, in Timor, because there's barely any flat ground, and because you're surrounded by ocean water, if you pump that aquifer too much, you're going to have saltwater intrusion. So you don't have a lot of lowland groundwater that you can pump in abundance, which means the water supply of this valley, of this nation, comes mostly from springs. You've got precipitation on these mountains, the water soaks in, and it pops out as springs. But through the over 400 years of Portuguese colonization, and then over the 27 years of Indonesian occupation, you had a degradation of this mountainous terrain, and you had a disruption of the hydrologic cycle, where you no longer had water soaking into the mountain areas, and you had springs dry up in mass. And the springs drying up were a great contributor to this high level of childhood malnutrition, because springs equal water equals farming. In this country, you actually have 70% of the population lives rurally and are subsistence farmers. So subsistence farmers in a highly challenging geography, mountainous geography, right? So what their strategy has been here has been spring restoration, watershed by watershed by watershed, similar to the same pattern that we see in India. And the permaculture project there, they have restored over 700 springs in the country. They estimate that there's only about 3,600 springs that they would have to restore, 3,600 of these micro watershed basins, to basically restore the water supply of the entire country. So they've actually restored about 20% of the springs in the entire nation, which is very significant. And this is a picture of one micro watershed basin, basically. And this is the same basin that we saw a picture of, but you see I took a Google Earth image and I drew a yellow line around that micro watershed basin. So this basin is about 57 hectares. And it's, there's a real variety. We visited some basins that were over 100 hectares. We visited some basins that were smaller than 57 hectares. So, of course, there's going to be a variety, but this is somewhere around typical for the size. So imagine, this scale, but times 700, and you start to get a scale of the work that's been done there already. And I'll give you a little bit of a tour of a few of the different structures that they used within to do the restoration work. So it's interesting because historically, the water buffalo on this island would create wallows. They would create pits that they would go soak in the mud. And these wallows became historically really important hydrological features of the island, because the water, when it rained, it would settle in these wallows and it would soak into the ground instead of running down the mountains. So here they're actually creating structures to mimic the wallows. Interestingly, I found that a lot of the structures that they had created there, I found a lot of things that I would consider technical issues with these water harvesting structures. Like, I'm not seeing a really established overflow to this water harvesting structure. The sides are very steep, where normally we would think of having more gentle sides, so the soil didn't collapse into the structure. So some of the stuff I was like, these don't necessarily match maybe the technical, the same technical level that I would imagine, or that probably the WFP. I mean, your work is very highly technical. So for any of you people that are more technicians, you might be like, that doesn't look quite right. But it seems to be working for them in the current context. They did a lot of check dams also in drainages. So just building rock check dams across valleys, across lowlands. And then behind this check dam, they've excavated out to create a larger soil container, a larger catchment pond, you might say, for the water to soak into, right? So simple rock check dams, and then simple contour bunds and reforestation. So you can see here, they're just doing little terraces or little swales on contour, and then either planting themselves or letting the natural regeneration happen from the surrounding forest. So these are really simple structures. Now, I've got to say, just another note on the technical features of these structures. They don't seem to be on the tropical cyclone track. They don't get the type of really big tropical cyclones that you'd see further south in Australia. So even though they get heavy rainfall, they don't seem to get really, really big storms. And so that might be why they can get away with having some structures that don't seem to be as technically designed as I would want to, because of the way the rainfall comes. It seems to be working for them. And then the results are, we find in these small little valleys and drainages, we find that the springs are coming back. So we have water popping out of the ground, and then they're boxing up those springs, and then they're piping them for water supply. And then some of the downstream effects. So I'll show you a few different examples of what they're doing now that the springs are restored. So you can see this is very steep mountainous terrain, but we have a recovery of some subsistence agriculture sites. So now you can see kind of in the upper right, you can see a water tank above this site, a couple different water tanks, and those water tanks now are getting spring water and irrigating, and then they are doing all of this terrace farming here to have intensive cultivation that is very directly helping the problem of malnutrition, of childhood malnutrition, in the vicinity. We also see these hillside food forests, right? Where they're creating permanent food security by planting these diverse assemblages of nutritious types of foods and other materials. And we see this multi-story food production. And then in the understory of these food jungles that they're growing from this spring water, we see coffee production. Coffee is the main agricultural export about 80% of their agriculture exports are coffee, and it's all 100% organic on the entire island. We see small businesses developing here. This is a compost production business. The compost is underneath these shade areas here, right? So small scale economic development from these spring restoration. And then we just see valley bottom homestead development. So at the bottom of this image, you can see a homestead here. You can see some little gardens, lots of fruit trees around. So small scale subsistence farming is greatly improved here. And okay. Rolling through here to my last slide, where I'll give you my takeaway messages, and then we'll have about a little over 20 minutes for questions. So first off, the fundamental flaw, in my opinion, of civilization is where we superimpose a grid of land management over the watershed pattern, right? And it creates a dysfunctional hydrologic cycle to start. Now, there are huge advantages to working within an intact watershed basin, like we saw in India. Now, massive scale projects like the Half Moon projects use small modular units to avoid the large scale failures that we could see in big structures, and they have flexibility within the watershed. Nations can systematically repair small watershed basins for a cumulative effect. And the repair of the hydrologic system trickles down to repairing economy, agriculture, and ultimately the social stability of a region, right? So you can see a lot of these stories in detail on my YouTube channel. A lot of the Paani Foundation stuff in India, in Rajasthan, I have a lot of videos about that. I have a number of videos about the World Food Program work. Like Natalie said, we've got cumulatively, we've got between 20 and 30 million views for the World Food Program projects. And then I'm working on a video of East Timor, probably early next year, I'll have that out. So that is my talk. I'm going to stop sharing now. And maybe Natalie, you can help organize any questions or comments people want to make. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. We've had an active chat where I'm sharing a number of resources. We can also plug in here the videos that Andrew has done with WFP and the general YouTube channel. But thanks, Andrew. I'm just chatting actually with Lorenzo. I don't know where Lorenzo is on the call here. I mean, you know, this is the conversation that we're trying to always have within WFP. How can we integrate this into so many of the different program and work streams that we have? You know, yesterday our team had a call with the nutrition team. I don't know if anyone is here from nutrition, but, you know, from our supply chains, SAMs, you know, support to smallholder agriculture market systems, our procurement, our nutrition, there's so many ways in which we can be leveraging our resources, not to do different things, but do things differently, as I say. So, you know, this is just reinforces, Andrew, the work that we know that we need to do to build real resilience for human beings from the ground up. And thanks for mentioning global cooling and moistening. Because as I always say, which I mentioned in the Taiwan presentation, if the problem is global warming, the assignment is global cooling. And the way we do that is through global moistening, because the soil, among many other things, is our air conditioning system. So this is just, it's so key. It's work we're doing within WFP. We need to be doing more of this. And we really need to understand the difference, you know, how the watershed is a factory for nutrition. And for the food security that is our mandate. So I am going to open it up to questions, but before I do that, I do want to put Atovoli Carucci on the spotlight to just react. And since, you know, Voli has for decades been our silverback gorilla of restoration and our sort of land ambassador within WFP. So I just wanted to give him the chance to respond to the presentation, but also give us some little diamonds of wisdom in this regard. And then we can open it up to questions. If people want to put questions in the chat, I can read them out, or you can feel free to raise your hand and turn on your camera and ask directly. Thanks. Atovoli.
Thank you very much, everyone, and particularly Andrew and yourself, Natalie, for having this organized and for this excellent presentation. I am pretty busy, but I really wanted to be here today. I always enjoyed the descriptions and the fascinating by what other examples can do, and the brain really goes fast. I could say that at this point in time, Andrew, you are probably the best worldwide ambassador of soil that that we could possibly have and dream, and also the ambassador of the good work that many of the staff that we have been honored to work with, and that go very silent under the radar, actually doing every day. They're not visible, they don't post things, but they are actually the protagonists of change, and those are my soil and landscape heroes. I've seen quite a few these days. Mauritania, actually, Mauritania invites you to come next year to see what they're doing, and there are very interesting also sites to see Mauritania, also as a person, as a tourist as well, not only for permaculture, but really incredible motivation and work that is changing really the people's lives, not from a rhetorical point of view, from a very practical point of view. It doesn't mean there are no issues. There are always issues, but we should take risks and correct mistakes and buy us some time. But it's clear that the areas, the more we go to scale, the more we see multiplier effects. And this my only repeated, let's say, recommendation is just to really match scale with quality to achieve multiplier effects. And that's one way that you could really cool at a larger scale, reduce hardships. That's very critical for what one thing that's not often mentioned is how land degradation, desertification in general impacts on women and children, but adolescent girls as well. So we do have that, overall 1 generation or 2 generation loss that is a result of land degradation. But the cooling effect, or the healing effect overall is critical, not only for the environment, for the ecology, but it's also for human beings to find hope, to find a way to strive through their daily ordeals, but also to aim at a better life. So we should be very careful not to romanticize land restoration, but to really take this as a serious professional business, a hard one, a difficult one, particularly for our staff, being confronted with some of the most difficult and challenging places on earth, right? And I've been privileged to see Ethiopia changing, at least in those many areas where we have done this kind of work, thanks to millions of people there who have actually taken this to scale. Rwanda has done the same. Part of Niger are doing the same. So we do hope to see this multiplied, and you have such a skill to tell the story using simple words and not filling with unchewable buzz, all what we normally try to sell, this long, incomprehensible, terminology. So keep really, selling the story, telling everyone how this is important beyond borders, beyond WFP, beyond everything. And I think we should all do that. And thank you for the great, good green news, the GGG news that you are bringing all the time. I'm not going to compete with Natalie on the creative semantics that she's using, but clearly I had one, which is SOS, Save Our Soils, which is Save Our Souls, because we are coming from soil, we are going back to soil. So at least that Natalie cannot take it from me. Just kidding.
And we are soil organisms. I mean, if you know anything about health and nutrition, our
Natalie,
gut
I know. Stop.
I'm
just kidding.
Just kidding. I want to say our gut microbiome, the bacteria that we have in our own gut, which provides much of our health, is derived directly from soil, and you can find those same microbes. Great. Thanks so
Absolutely.
much,
Anyway,
Rolly.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. We want to open it up. We've got some time. So if anyone wants to turn on your cameras and discuss, and it doesn't have to be a question. Is there a comment, a thought that you have about this approach, about how to integrate this? Yeah, just feel free to raise your hand. I can't see. Oh, yeah, Thiago, go ahead. Thiago has just joined our Yemen team not long ago and has also attended a training in resilience design in Uganda, and then was really the impetus of starting this approach in South Sudan, and hopefully can now get traction in Yemen depending on the situation. But welcome, Thiago.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, Andrew. It's a very inspiring presentation, very helpful, for us to always keep in mind what is out there. And some of these projects we know, some of them are beyond what WFP is working on. So it's always good to freshen up our ideas, and very good reconnecting with Volley as well. Yes, as Natalie mentioned, I'm currently in Yemen. Just this morning, we're looking at some of these sites. As you are aware, of course, the water scarcity issue in Yemen is very severe. One of the most severe in the world. And then, yeah, we are, of course, applying the principles of regenerative agriculture, resilience design in the new cycle of WFP interventions in the country. And of course, here one of the challenges, we have less models of what works with this type of terrain, which is extremely rocky, extremely arid, looking at what types of crops, what types of local resources are available, and building from there. And the politicization of the water management is also a big issue, right? So whenever we talk about sources of water, they have traditional ways of managing the runoff of the rainwater, of the flooding, and we have to be, of course, very careful on how to engage in those conversations, right? So we are also not creating distortions or doing more harm than good. With the water management always has somebody who benefits, and in this case, other people who might not or might cease to benefit, and this is also cause for traditional disputes. So I just wanted to invite you to speak a bit more about your experience on the more severely water scarce countries, and what types of good practices you've seen. That we know about the Green the Desert initiative in Jordan, that has an interesting permaculture initiative there, and just any other examples that you've seen where we're starting from a severely degraded land that has already a severe water scarcity problem that is made worse now, of course, with climate change. What would be the entry points you see in those locations? Thank you.
Sorry, Andrew, I just want to make one point, which I did make in the chat that I know you can't see. I've worked in Yemen, Thiago, and one thing I know that a lot of people will think this is controversial. Yemen does not have water scarcity. Somalia does not have water scarcity. Chad, Niger, Mauritania don't have water scarcity. They have design scarcity and they have capture scarcity. But if you quantify the amount of water that actually falls in a year in Somalia or Yemen, it is more water than anybody can use. The problem is that it's being lost. It's artificially, the infrastructure, the hydrological infrastructure has been severed, and that water is leaving. So it's enough water that's leaving. So the question is, how do we get that water to stay? How do we plant the rain, slow spread, and sink that water into the system? But that is an important mindset shift, that if we knew that if we all view these landscapes of having enough water, how do we protect and catch it? Imagine your bank account has a huge leak. You'll find a way to plug that very quickly. But anyway, sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to make that point, but go ahead with your response.
Oh, yeah, sure. I actually was on the same trip that I just went to Timor-Leste. I spent 10 days in Saudi Arabia looking at a lot of the greening projects they're doing in Riyadh and in the vicinity. And, that's an area that gets about 100 millimeters of rainfall a year. And I was pretty astounded by the vegetation that they were establishing on 100 millimeters of rainfall a year. I mean, they were doing some initial supplemental irrigation. We looked at a project, I believe they're planting 700,000 trees north of the city in order to stop the Shamal winds before they come down into Riyadh, the north winds. And they had done half moons, and this is kind of flatter terrain. They did a version of half moons, but not done by hand. They were a little more crude, just doing with some sort of machine equipment. They were planting very hardy desert trees in there, and they were doing some initial irrigation, some drip irrigation, just for the first couple years to get them established. But I was astounded at how well they were doing on really on the 100 millimeters a year. The other place, though, that I've seen that is really impressive, that sounds sort of analogous. I like to look at the climate zones to see like analogous areas. And in the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, which is the most densely inhabited desert on the planet, where there's a lot of these kind of rocky domes and then farms down below, there's really, really interesting techniques that they're doing, first intercepting the water before it even leaves the rocky areas and just trying to get it to soak in these detention basins into crevices and start to build that water table. And then they have this really interesting, and again, like we can't get too detailed right now, but at the base of these rocky domes, before they hit the farm, they're actually building walls, like dry stack rock walls on contour to try to slow the first flush of water off of those rocky domes. And then that stops the velocity. And then down below, they have a contour infiltration basin. Then they get the water through the rock wall, and then they soak it down. And then they're basically soaking into the water and then pulling it out. The water table's right there. And so I don't know. I haven't looked at rainfall of Yemen to see how that compares with the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, but they have very advanced water harvesting. I've done some video work also there to show some of their structures. So that would probably be the analogs that I would look at to look at like advanced water harvesting structures in a similar, potentially similar geography and similar climate. Yeah.
Thanks. And Andrew, actually, this is a lot of the expertise that we have in-house that a lot of people don't recognize. I really want to shine a light. Where's my brother from another mother, Jonathan? Jonathan is like the silent guru. He did, I think, Voli will correct me for sure if I'm wrong, 10-meter high, dry, stacked stone check dam walls in Ethiopia. So we maybe Jonathan or somebody, or I can after the chat, put in a link, in our PGM, starting on page 114, we have an annex with all the info texts, which are guidance snapshots on how to do all kinds of earthworks. Andrew will know what I mean when I say that permaculture can be very swale-centric. Swale is an internationally recognized term, Voli, for a ditch on contour. There are other names for it, like trenches, but really it's on contour, and it helps to slow spread and sink the water. And that's really so much of this approach. Again, trees that used to hold water in the landscape. Don't forget, when it rains in a forest, up to 90% of the rain falls and doesn't leave the forest. It gets soaked into that spongy material. So when you remove that forest, you created an artificial release and destabilize that hydrology. So I just wanted to point that out. Slow spread and sink in order to do what we call plant the rain. Before we plant the crops, we want to plant the rain. And by the way, this is how we can extend the growing season, by focusing not only on water security, but moisture security, cool temperature security. We protect the ability of that land to produce food even after the rains have gone. So I don't know if somebody can share that soil and stone buns, Natalie. Yeah, there are different names for them. The point is, permaculture is an anti-gravity movement. We're trying to do whatever we can to keep that water higher up in the system. Water will always go downhill. We just want that to happen under the soil, where it can take a year to go several meters versus seconds on top. Okay, I think we have some other questions. I see Lutgard and then Felix Andy. Go ahead, Lutgard.
Thank you. I'm from the Norwegian, hi, from the Norwegian Development Agency, NORAD. I have a question related to invasive species. Like, what do you do in areas, for example, in the lowlands of Eastern Africa or the Horn of Africa, pastoral areas, where there is a lot of prosopis, which has been introduced earlier in the 80s to regenerate soil, but now is a super invasive, takes up a lot of water and so on. Like, how do because we don't, as far as I know, we don't know if you take that into the natural succession process, it might take over completely. So what are your suggestions in such cases? Thanks.
I do want to add, sorry, Andrew, because throughout the whole of East Africa, I've seen, like, literally physically through the whole of East Africa, Yemen, India, all that prosopis reaches. Now, many people will say that the reason that the land is degrading is because of the spread of prosopis. That's not the case. That's a perception. And we tend to vilify prosopis, but in many cases, it's actually the only thing remaining in the landscape that is providing carbon in terms of leaf fall and nitrogen. There's so many different things that can be done with it. Andrew, the prosopis we're talking about is a mesquite that is growing wild like crazy, but there are many other ways. There are things like biochar, range blocks for dry season fodder. I'll let Andrew give his perspective. I don't like to talk about, I just think it's funny when humans call any other species invasive, because there's literally nothing more invasive on the planet and beyond than humans. They are prolific. So the question is, how do we play jujitsu that you can't uproot them? But then the question is, how can we leverage their presence through biochar, other ways of soil building? But Andrew, go ahead and add on to that.
Okay, well, I was actually really curious to see what Voli had to say as an answer to that question. Like Natalie said, the sort of permaculture perspective would be, well, okay, it's really difficult to get rid of prosopis. How can we either utilize them, and then in a particular location, are there species that we could introduce that would succeed the prosopis? Right. So can we actually interplant other species that would, potentially benefit from the conditions that the prosopis created, and then grow and overshadow the prosopis? I know that, one of the sites that we visited in Chad, and, first off, I wanted to say just a couple of things really quick. Is traveling around with Voli for 2 weeks in Niger and Chad was, I feel like I took like a graduate level class on Sahelian restoration. So I really appreciate that. But I know we went to one site where there was prosopis, and really the problem with the prosopis was that it had these low thorny branches that were just hitting people and livestock in the eyes, And so, there's one thing, well, just going and say whacking off the bottom branches can, at least in some situations, can mitigate that immediate danger. So there's some kind of cultural control we could have in different corridors, but yeah, the permaculture perspective would be like, okay, this is part of ecological succession. How can we accelerate succession to a state that moves beyond the prosopis? And that's pretty theoretical, and I've never seen that in practice, but that would be one perspective to look at it with. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Voli wanted to add something, and then we'll go on to Felix.
No, just to say that I kind of agree with both of. I agree with you, Natalie. There is no an evil species anywhere, including eucalyptus. I've seen eucalyptus growing in Ethiopia. When it is in a ratio 1:4, 1:5 plants, it actually encouraged the growth of indigenous species. It's a total contradiction what we thought before. I was an anti-eucalyptus person myself. And actually, I had to reconsider everything, because there were actually Igenia abyssinica, the Podocarpus gracilor growing under. So at 1:5 ratio, it was okay. At pure stand, it was lethal. It was actually a terrible plant. It was a weed. So it's, and the same with prosopis. It can be educated. It's a great plant to colonize alkaline, really super alkaline soils. The only thing I could see growing in huge gullies, completely alkaline, in Myanmar, and we use that, and it can be educated. In Myanmar, it was educated. It was never really becoming invasive species, at least in the dry zone. In many places in Niger, it's been there for sand dune stabilization for decades. It has never become a problem. In other places, it becomes a problem. So because it's along the specific path and it's not controlled. So in Kenya, they shift from prosopis eradication program to prosopis control program because they realized that along Lake Turkana, a lot of the prosopis were feeding the fish with all the pods. And then in some other areas became a business because they were collecting, trucks were coming collecting the pods for the beef farm somewhere in Nairobi and so on. So again, we need to really see case by case, but there are indeed places where it becomes a problem, and it depends also from the type of soil, for the type of transhumance routes. But yeah, it has its place. Prosopis has really its place. There's not only one species of prosopis. We're talking about largely Euriflora here, but there are several prosopis as well.
Yeah, Lutgaard, does that answer your question, or did you want to add anything more on that?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering what the general perspective was on including invasive species. So thanks, that's answered.
One of the principles of permaculture is turning the problem into the solution. So, prosopis definitely is viewed by a lot of humans as problematic, pastoralists, right? The sugary pods and the thorns are a very real issue. So then the question is, how do we play jujitsu to flip this problem on its head and try to derive benefit from it? So anyway, I mean, I would welcome, Lutgaard, if you were looking at, some solutions. We could definitely have a call another time. Absolutely. Thanks for your question. Then I see, yes, Felix, Andy, and then Isa.
Okay. I'm trying. Yeah. Okay. My camera is on now. I hope you can see. Good evening. Good afternoon. I'm Felix, working here in Juba, South Sudan, and I'm part of the Asset Creation and Livelihood Program team. So in the last 1.5 years, we have incorporated landscape regeneration works into our Asset Creation and Livelihood program. And South Sudan has a very diverse kind of landscape. So we've tried our regeneration techniques in the water stressed areas, like where our colleague Diego, who just spoke like a couple of minutes ago, where he was based. We've done landscape restoration activities there quite successfully, but our challenge is in other places where the landscape is generally very flat. What we've seen is we've tried to establish some demo gardens somewhere in western northern Bargazal, and because of the flat terrain, when the rainfall comes in, it nearly like just sweeps out everything because the land is very flat. Like you cannot have a difference of two contours barely exceeding 10 centimeters in a space of 2 meters on horizontally. So we have a very flat land, and then there is water scarcity in those places, but when the little rainfall comes, it comes very huge with a lot of waves, and the whole place is just swept off. So how do we go around this kind of landscape if we want to keep the water there and to sink it for it to keep the moisture? Thank you. That was my question.
Andrew, you want to talk about flat ground and water harvesting?
Yeah, I would say that the best example, I actually showed one when I showed the slide of the village with the lake in front of it in India. That is a broad scale example of flatland design over a very large area where, the thing about flatlands is that one well-placed embankment can create a very large area where water is held back and infiltrated. And so in that example, which is in Rajasthan, which again, very arid, very hot, and very long dry season, and then very short, intense rains, they actually created a series of embankments and large areas that become inundated throughout the watershed, where they interconnected the water supply ponds from different villages across across large areas, and they actually created like a very large scale landscape water harvesting system, because in that situation, one small structure can just get overwhelmed. So I think on really flat lands, aside from, of course, we saw the half moons. I mean, so the half moons, you could just, you know, I think of it as like imprinting that pattern over a very large landscape. So I think the half moons are a flatland solution, as long as they're not just completely flooded from above, like as long as they're not, you know, they're not like right in the force of the water. But I do think that a large flatland, you have to have a large scale integrated design to really manage water over in that landscape. And I would say, I can put this one video in the chat. I would say watch this one video that I did actually visit, and I documented and diagrammed out this system that really is over large flat land. So I'm going to put that in the chat, and that would be that's my best example that I can share. So give me a second there. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything, Natalie, or.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, which I probably will disagree with, but maybe not. There's really no such thing as flat, like a table land anywhere in the world except underwater. It's only underwater that things will settle and you'll find a completely perfectly flat ground. So even Felix, I mean, I've been working in South Sudan, by the way, for 20 years. So I know every single state in the whole country. What you're talking about in Capueta, just think about South Sudan as a whole. You know, you got water coming off of the Imatong Mountains. Everything is heading towards Greater Upper Nile, Capueta, you know, Upper Nile, all, you know, the different states there, Unity State. And so even if you have a small structure, you know, water will always, as I said, even if it's the tiniest slope, that water will head on into a half moon or a structure. And this is where it gets important to decide on the correct structures for that landscape. You know, as Andrew is mentioning, if you created a giant wall across a valley, even in a low area, you're going to create a lake. But those smaller half moons provide smaller opportunities that are modular, that can be, you know, crafted in different ways to really capture the huge amount of rain. And again, I wanted to just stress there absolutely is no water scarcity in South Sudan. It rains for 6 months like Forrest Gump rain. If you remember that movie, he says sometimes it even rains from bottom up. It really, we have to change our thinking a bit to say there is enough water that's here. What can we do to capture it? But the other thing I wanted to mention, Felix, because there's such a massive pastoral ancient culture in South Sudan, is the governance. I have full faith in the hydrology, biology, geology to do its job, but people are the unpredictable part. And so those community governance structures, the traditional peace accords between communities, you know, even in the Sahel, and Voli can vouch to this, people have had traditional peace accords saying, okay, your community can come on this side during this part of the year, we can go on that side during part of the year. But right now we're experiencing such extreme and violent weather behavior that those agreements no longer can hold up. And even, you know, it was 10 years ago that in Senegal, all the animals had to be moved down to the southern part of the country. And if you look at a lot of the Sahel work, much of it is in land that you would think is flat, you know, that we might perceive to the eye as flat, but you can see the, you know, hundreds of thousands of hectares that have been restored just by responding to the natural patterns. So yeah, maybe Voli wants to add on to that. And then I think Isa had his hand up.
No, you're absolutely right, Natalie. Even in the Sahel, 0.1, 0.2% slope, which is almost impossible to notice by the eye, is an important slope if you're, you know, dealing with crusted soil, pavement crusts over hundreds and thousands of hectares. So it is, you know, and again, land degradation is also an expression not only about the gradient of slope, but the length of slope and the type of soil. So we are seeing this lack of, you know, infiltration because of the nature of the soil. You know, sandy loams are typically prone to crust. Such a slope is irrelevant in Ethiopia. It's actually a waterlogged, very waterlogged prone soil. You need improved drainage. So in Ethiopia, we start thinking about, or part of Kenya, about a slope above 3, 5, 6% range, you know, a gradient. So it's really context specific again in type of soil, type of climate as well, and the rainfall intensity pattern, which is something that is not often spoken about, because in the Sahel, very common to have even 100 or above 100 millimeters rainfall intensity per hour. So it's and in 3 cracks of the whip, as I say here, the rainy season is over in terms of real good rain. So even the structures have to be calibrated to receive that maximum amount that could fall at any given time, and capture and store it. And even we have created an ABCDEFG for soil and water retention to explain to technicians and farmers. So there are conditions that will dictate also the calibration of what we need to do. Sorry, I need to leave you, but thank you very much. Greetings from Mauritania, and everybody is saying hello around the team here.
Thanks, Foley. And also the water has to have an exit strategy. What you can't just, design land and that water, it has to have an exit strategy to leave from one system to the next. And the opposite problem is about, how to prevent that water logging. If you have flooding in one area, like Greater Upper Nile region of South Sudan, the question then becomes what can you do higher up in the system, higher up in the catchment, higher up in the watershed? How do you get water to be captured there before it accumulates into a flood event? And if we talk about that at scale, in South Sudan, if you look at everything that's happening in the Nile River Basin, I live here in Nairobi, there's a growing middle class. Nairobi is becoming more and more covered in concrete. Even outside of my window, there was a forest there last year. Now I have a big giant 6-floor construction project. All that water that would have been captured by that forest is making its way towards the sump of South Sudan. So if you look at the entire Nile River Basin of South Sudan, whatever's happening in Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, all these cities, that water that would originally have stayed in the system and hydrated and fed our forests is now artificially rolling off and collecting into South Sudan. So that's the opposite issue of when you have flatness that is flooding, the question then becomes, how do we stop the water before it arrives here so it can feed and hydrate another part of the system? But Andrew, go ahead on that topic. Or do we, sorry. Never mind. Isa, come on in, and I think you had a question or comment. You're on mute, Isa.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to this, especially Serena. My name is Isa Amran. I work with the WFP Security in Jordan, Amman. I love your videos, Andrew. Thank you for this nice webinar. I have one simple question. All this knowledge, all this know-how, has it been, or has anybody thought about bringing it into one platform or one system where somebody can actually simulate, suggest, or design and have it accessible to the local farmers or government or something like that? I mean, does it have to be always human intervention, like Andrew, like Natalie, like anybody else to design these things per location, or can some kind of platform automatically using AI design these things and have it accessible to the public? That's my question.
Yeah.
Well, if we did nothing, the land would return. The whole, sorry, Andrew, because we talk about scalability all the time, and people are like, is this approach scalable? Literally to the planetary level. This is the original design model of our planet. So if we did nothing, if the land hasn't been too degraded, it would return to its natural state, which of course is dynamic. And Andrew will have another answer to this question. Some of the links I've shared are some of the guides that are really relevant to WFP, because some of the resources may not be for WFP specifically. And we are working on that. By the way, Isa, we're working on a regenerative LTA to bring in experts for WFP for different topics, so that all regional offices and country offices can select from shortlisted experts on this. So we are trying to make that available. But Andrew, other than Andrew's YouTube channel and a couple of other key 3D models, is there a clearinghouse? Can somebody just go to one place and find how to do all this stuff, Andrew?
Well, I think really what Isa is asking is, can machine learning replace the humans in this? And I would say, well, first off, there's a lot of people that are asking this question. I've had this question a lot, and I've been approached by a number of people who have tried to do this. And first off, I would say ultimately no. I would say that just like you can't really trust AI to do anything without humans checking over it, because AI tends to make things up, or find or base its decisions on untrue information. Where I do think that machine learning could really help is in collating the analysis data, where I would love to see where you can actually put a site in and have it say, okay, soil type, wind direction, watershed, analyzing past land uses based on satellite data, right? I think that there's a lot of information that could be collected by a machine and put out, but I feel like and then this is another thing, is there's so much nuance. There's so much, and I really got this traveling around with Voli, and each location we went to, and I say, what about this? Couldn't you do this? Couldn't you do this? There's so much cultural nuance in doing this work in places where there are complex human dynamics. So I do know of like permaculture people that are working to try and create a sort of machine brain that can come up with, designs and things like that. But I don't know if we'll ever be able to get the human element out of the decision-making process, so yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, please.
What you said is exactly what I was asking for. If we have the information, let's say Serena, Natalie, they want to design for Jordan. They need foot soldiers. They also have the satellite imagery. They have the expertise. So they basically can suggest the design. The more information they get from the people on the ground, including farmers, government, whoever, basically everybody collaborating on this platform electronically until you get down to the actual final implementation. So basically some kind of cooperating platform where I can asking you, this is my problem, this is the region I want you to look at, how much humidity, how much solar, how much population density, the kind of, so I'll give you the soil samples. I'll go there as WFP or as government. If you need LiDARs or whatever, basically collate all the technical information that you might need for maybe those the LTAs that Natalie talked about, those experts to design what do you call it, ecosystem regenerative system. All the missing technical information that you need or the entire system needs, so that you can design this thing, including how much manpower, how much rainwater, what's the recovery time, is it like 1 year? You in your presentation you talked about somewhere in India in one cycle, 6 months they were able to restore entire ecosystem. If you go to Saudi Arabia, it took them like 7 years in Al-Bayda area to recover one ecosystem. So basically to have everything ready all up until the point of execution. Is there such a project or platform to do that? That's basically without AI.
Yeah, I would say that does not exist that I know of. But it seems like having a database where you just actually have the, climate, soil type, geology, geography, the project, the statistics around that project, if you could even just being able to go in and put in your location and having it geo-reference you other projects around the world that would be analogous, would save all this research. Because I mean, like say Natalie and I, say the collective amount of different projects that we know about, it's like, there's not a lot of other people, say, that have been researching this for years and years that know where a lot of this stuff is going on. And I don't really know a collective database, but I think it would be very valuable. I think it's a great idea. Yeah. But Natalie is the WFP's database for a lot of this stuff, you know, because wait, Natalie, what's your title? You're the
Global Advisor for Regenerative Resilience.
Yeah, Global Advisor for Regenerative Resilience. So right now, yeah, unfortunately, it is put in a human for a database, but you know, I think that, but Natalie is your person right now that can access that information. But yeah, I think it's a great idea that really could accelerate, you know, and a lot of it's just like collecting all of this information from all these, you know, like, you know, how can you just download everything that Voli sees on a day-to-day basis of all the sites that he's visiting around the world? You know, how do we download everything that Natalie has as well and have it all on a searchable database?
And, you know, I love this conversation because I've talked in the past about three different types of technologies, right? You have natural technology, the ecological infrastructure, the way that nature creates its systems. Then you have indigenous technology, which is always how humans, civilizations, farmers have partnered with the intelligence of nature. And then we have modern technology. Now, for me, the aim of modern technology should be to enhance our relationship with the other two technologies, right? Not that we discard, and that is a lot of the problem that we have in our modern world, is that we disregard, ignore, throw away the natural technologies, the indigenous technologies, and prop up on a pedestal modern technology, which should be a tool to enhance our relationship with the others. And I think this is a perfect example. I'm sure we will get to a point, Andrew, like a permaculture app, you can just plug in your sectors and take a picture. But there is so much nuance. And really, good design is bespoke, on the ground. You know, I mean, Jonathan knows very well through our CBPP processes and our boot camps. We are really harvesting from the consultants who are the community members on the ground. No one knows better their situation. They're the consultants. But when we go together and we all walk together with our different perspectives and walk the water, you know, you'll have stony areas and rills and erosion patterns, and every one of those should have a bespoke design solution to it. And you know, in Samburu, where we did the boot camp, you know, you have some nomadic tribes that were not there during the training. We would have no idea. There's so many social and cultural pressures that can't really be you know, accounted for in a high-tech model. This is why I always say we have to focus on AI, but not the AI that, you know, we know of, but the ancient innovation. AI is ancient innovation, and then how do these tools enhance that process? But I love that question, Isa. Who else? Oh, hi, Carlo. Carlos in South Sudan.
Yes.
My dude, how are you?
Hello.
Yes.
Fine. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you very much. This is Carl from South Sudan. The presentation is very good, very informative with the thoughts that shared here. They are very, very good. It will help us. As you know, Natalie and the rest, when you were here with us, we move a lot in the field. You have seen some parts here in South Sudan are really different from one state to another. But mostly, like here in Barakazal, up to Upper Nile, you'll find that the land is actually flat, and we have a lot of water. It is a flooding-prone areas. And our problem actually is not water. Is not a lack of water. We have a lot of water because the area gets flooded. So some of the techniques actually may not work here because of the context and the context and the type of land that we have here. So what can really be done here? You know very well from this part of Baragazal after Upper Nile, it is water, and the land actually is flat. What the best approach, the best technique that we can use to harvest water, so that to make sure this water can become an opportunity for the community to use it, and also to manage the land that can really stay longer and the benefit on it. So how do you help us to actually to use some of the techniques? Of course, in eastern part of South Sudan, that is Kafoita, where Tiako was, some of the approach, some of the techniques like half moons, it can work. We have some stories there, but this about 80% of the land is flat here. So how do you really help us to
Are
work
you in northern
Baragazal
or western Baragazal?
We are in I am in Warap, just close to northern Baragazal.
Okay, between Wow and Awil in Warap.
Yes, they are very close. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes.
you remember, Carla, when we were there and we were talking about the flooding that was happening there, and what I said was that, you know, in Wow town, you've had people need to understand that for, you know, millions of people have been coming back since 2015, repatriating into South Sudan. But the brick production in Wow town I'm just going to give this an example as a small scale. Higher up in the watershed, you have a town called Wow, where everyone is chopping down trees to burn bricks, and then they're harvesting and degrading soil to make the bricks for burning. And when you see all of the release of that water, which is silting up the river there, and that is what's causing the breaching. Now, if we zoom out, Carlo, I mean, there are things obviously that can be done in Wow, which you saw the back to office report I shared. There are a lot of different ideas, but what I really love is the conversation that we've been having with the South Sudan team. When I've said we've got to be talking about transboundary water realities, same with the Iraq team. The entire Mesopotamian marsh has been totally desiccated because of what's happening in Turkey, you know, and higher up in the Tigris and Euphrates River. And just as Andrew was showing in his presentation, water hydrology does not care about our legal, you know, administrative boundaries. So we really have to understand watersheds, and even in Western or not, I mean in Warab State, which is quite flat, I will say, it's not completely flat though. Another major problem, however, in South Sudan is the infrastructure that has been built since the signing of the peace agreement. And you know, because of the clay soils, they make these very high marm roads which block the hydrology. So I know for sure much of the flooding that is experienced is because the new infrastructure is blocking the natural hydrological flow of the water. So I think there's multi-parts to your question. There are things that can be done in Wow. In Warab State, you've got a lot of pastoralists, but they're agro-pastoralists. The way they're growing sorghum, you guys are trying rice now with some of them because it does get very flooded. But I think the question then for the South Sudan team as a whole is, how do we have a watershed approach, including transboundary water conversations with Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and all other tributaries to the Nile River Basin. So there's a mild, medium, and spicy approach, Carlo, but we can continue discussing on that. But you know, Andrew, it's a very unique context, South Sudan, but you can answer just from a general perspective.
Oh, I don't really know that I have anything to add because it sounds like a pretty specific. I'm looking on the map right now. I mean, it sounds like a pretty specific geography, but I did share a number of videos in the chat that specifically address flatland, or, you know, what we would think of as flatland scenarios. A couple from India, and then also I know that Natalie, I'm not sure where the South Sudan Chinampas are located, what part of the country, but Natalie did a couple a project where she was actually mimicking a system, and I put the video in from Mexico. I put the video in the chat. A lowland flood area system for cultivation where you actually build up areas and create raised cultivation areas, and then you dig down and you have lowland, inundated areas, flooded areas. And so I know that Natalie actually did some projects like that in South Sudan, and I'm not sure like it's the same area, but you can look and you can see that video I posted on the chat from Mexico City, and you can see how the Aztecs dealt with this lowland flooded situation. Yeah.
Yeah, so what Andrew's referring to, Carlo, and everyone, and by the way, we are like totally over time. I'm okay to continue, but we recognize that the call's over and people need to leave. What Andrew's referring to is in Bentiu, Carlo. Oh wait, this is not the video, sorry. You know, the place is completely flooded, and there's two things. There's a historical flooding pattern because of the whole area is a swamp, but then there's extra water coming in, and some people will say, oh, it's climate change. I say we have to understand the behavior of water, of the hydrology in the entire basin, how much water is being artificially released versus how much is actually much more rain volumes. But in Mexico City, which also was a swamp, the Aztec civilization did an entire system of chinampas, which are these raised, let me just make sure this is the right video that I'm copying in here. Yeah. So I mean, I have mixed feelings about this project. The community loved it, donors loved it, and I'll try to dig up pictures because now these chinampas, this island bed zone, we know that it's going to be very flooded when the rain comes. There are now many of these that the donor funded, but when we made these, we layered so many organic materials, dead fish, fish waste, manures, grasses, and then soil, and made like a lasagna. This is so productive now. I'll see if I can find the photos. And we, by the way, brought in some bamboo, Anders, non-invasive, the clumping types of bamboo, not the creeping types, to stabilize the edges of the chinampas, because historically in Mexico, they were using willow trees, which we don't have. But basically now they are just these unbelievable islands that people in Bentiu, they use the canoes to go from the island to harvest melons and bananas, and they're unbelievably productive. The problem with doing this in South Sudan is you have to factor in calories in versus calories out. You know, the amount of human energy that is required to build and maintain one of these, you have to ask, you know, what exactly is the equivalent of, you know, food or nutrition that I'm getting for that amount of energy. The donor did let us bring in excavators and do it that way, but is that really sustainable? And, you know, with this whole approach, Andrew and everybody here on the call, you know, my question is always, how do we get people to be back on their feet, independent as quickly as possible, and not be in this risk zone of creating dependency on aid, which can impact economies and so many things. So really using permaculture and regenerative practices and design, you know, Isa was asking earlier about inputs. And this is really the only way to grow food without chemicals, without fake seeds that we give, you know, to people, and then grandma's hanging her maize thinking she can plant it again next year. So all, you know, everything that we're talking about is really, in my mind, the only way to build true resilience. Yes, totally organic. And I always say you can't do regenerative agriculture with degenerative seeds. Those seeds are specifically engineered not to reproduce, and their entire purpose is to deliver the chemicals that corporations want to send. That's a whole nother webinar. But anyway, Carla, to answer your question, you know, there are many things that can be done in WOW locally within the catchment. I would start with WOW, you know, working with the government in Western Bahr Ghazal to start to hold that water in Western Bahr Ghazal before it flows into our upstate. And then as a country as a whole has got to be having conversations with Kenya, Tanzania, and all the countries that touch this specific watershed. Great. Anyway, I know we are definitely, oh, Andrew, go ahead if you want to add to
no, I
that.
was going to say, I'm going to have to get going here in a minute. So
Yeah. No, I think we can wrap it up. We definitely had an extended Q&A, which is great. Love to see everybody being engaged. Is there any other last comment or question? Don't forget, you can reach out to me, Jonathan, Lorenzo, our team at headquarters, although I'm based in Nairobi. But I'm always available for anyone to reach out. If you want to have a chat, a call, a brown bag for your office, Isa, or anyone, then we can totally arrange that. Otherwise, if there's no other comment or question, Andrew, thanks for waking me up at like 3 in the morning. Andrew's calling in from Corvallis, Oregon, and Serena and I had to sheepishly say, "Oh, we've had a time change. Can you please, not sleep so that you can present to us instead?" So thanks so much, Andrew, for doing this. Great as always, and. Yeah, we look further engagement, and we are working on another video from Chad in the Tandu Valley that Andrew will be working on and releasing in who knows when. So, any other last thought, Andrew?
I just want to thank you, Natalie, for organizing this, and it was really great talking to, connecting with people from all over the world. It's a really good feeling to just feel connected to the work that the WFP is doing. And I'm just really, really grateful to have this opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I know everyone will have loved it. I am going to upload this onto YouTube. And then you will receive a copy of the recording in this chat, but I'll also share the YouTube link here in case anybody wants to share it externally. And we already have permission from Andrew to do that. So thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks everyone for joining. Really happy to see all this interest. Have a great.
Take care.
Have a great weekend.
Great. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.